Good evening. My name is Gil Lehner, and I'm the Consul for Public Diplomacy at the Consul General of Israel in New York. I would like to thank each and every one of you for joining us for tonight's program. The music you've heard earlier was played by Eden Ladin, a third-year student at the Jazz Center here at the New School, and the recipient of the American Israel Cultural Foundation Award. Mr. Ladin is one of a group of Israeli students here at the New School. Some of them are in the crowd tonight. Tonight's event is an intimate and special program bringing together friends and guests to remember the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. I, along with many of you in the audience, as well as every Israeli who is old enough, remember exactly where we were on the night of November 4th, 1995. I remember every moment as if it happened last night. Tonight, we remember Yitzhak Rabin, the soldier, the diplomat, the leader, the man. Now, I would like to welcome to the stage the Acting Consul General of Israel in New York, Mr. Ido Aharoni, to share his opening remarks with us and introduce our main speakers. Mr. Aharoni.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you, friends, for being here. I was given the pleasant task of introducing our speakers today, and I'd like to start with the first speaker. By the way, both of them need no introduction, but I do it because I know that we're actually online right now and are way more people watching us. So for the benefit of those who are not familiar with the history of our two distinguished speakers, I'd like to begin with Dr. Henry Kissinger. Dr. Henry Kissinger is one of the world's most distinguished diplomats, an illustrious scholar of international relations, and a maker of peace. He fled Germany with his family in 1938 to escape the Nazis, only to return 6 years later to fight as an American soldier. His commitment to his new country was utter, and he continued to serve with high distinction as the U.S. National Security Advisor and later as Secretary of State during the Nixon and Ford presidencies. Dr. Kissinger had more in common with Yitzhak Rabin than just the Nobel Peace Prize, which he won in 1973 for his work to end the Vietnam conflict. 21 years before, he was awarded to Mr. Rabin himself for his own gallant pursuit of peace with the Palestinians. Dr. Kissinger was no stranger to Israel, however. After the Yom Kippur War, also in 1973, he was central to bringing about an end to hostilities and bringing relative calm to Israel. Dr. Kissinger is also no stranger to me as a diplomat, as I owe much of my understanding of my own profession to him and to his masterful book, Diplomacy. Usually when someone asks me if an American official is good for Israel, I respond truthfully that if he strives to keep the United States safe and strong and promotes our values of democratic values, freedom and peace, he is by definition also a friend of Israel. And Henry Kissinger is without a doubt exactly such a person. The second guest speaker that we have here today is Dan Rather. For a generation, Dan Rather has been one of the most recognized and respected names in broadcast journalism. As a young man in Texas, he chose a career that would bring him to fearlessly apply his personal and professional values to the world, freedoms guaranteed by great democracies like the United States and Israel, but alien to so many of our fellow men in more restrictive societies. Yet Mr. Rather never feared to tread there or to ask tough questions when he did. I must tell you again that Henry Kissinger is not the only author whose work played a profound role in my professional career. The Camera Never Blinks by Dan Rather was a key work in my study, not of diplomacy this time, but of media studies here in America. Although today, truth be told, the two, media and politics, it's very difficult to tell them apart. Dan Rather too is no stranger to Israel and no stranger to Yitzhak Rabin. As the longtime anchorman of CBS Evening News, he reported strongly and fairly on our region, both the good and the bad. Mr. Rather was in Israel when Yitzhak Rabin, then our prime minister, a man who had fought so hard to achieve peace for his country, was gunned down. And at the funeral, when President Bill Clinton said the final shalom to his friend Yitzhak, Dan Rather was the only American news anchor to hear this in person. So please welcome our two guest speakers, Dr. Henry Kissinger and Dan Rather.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're privileged and honored to have Dr. Henry Kissinger with us tonight. And Dr. Kissinger, taking off from that point, I have so many questions, so little time. But in your judgment and with time to reflect, what is the principal legacy of Yitzhak Rabin?
You know, Yitzhak, first of all, I want to say I'm here because he was a dear friend of mine. The fact that he was Prime Minister of Israel and ambassador is important, but it's not why I'm here. Now, what is his legacy? In my experience, he went through all the ambivalences Israelis must have about the problem of peace and the problem of security. He would have preferred, initially, he was extremely distrustful of the PLO and even more so of Arafat. But then as the peace process evolved, he came to a commitment to attempt to contribute to it. And he was really basically very shy and taciturn person. But suddenly, after the peace process started, he delivered speeches of really extraordinary eloquence. So I think, to me, he represents the ambivalences and complexities of the Jewish existence in Israel and the commitment to find a peaceful solution.
When did you first meet him?
I met him before I was Henry Kissinger. I had written some articles in the book about strategy, and I met him shortly after the 1967 war. I was in Israel, and he invited me to give a lecture to the whatever, I don't know whether they call it general staff, to the generals in his headquarters. And afterwards he took me to lunch and we walked through the streets of Tel Aviv. And people were sort of wanting to talk to him, and he had just been the commanding general of the 67 war. And he was embarrassed by all this attention. And that's when we first met, and from then developed a very close relationship.
And what were your first impressions of him?
Well, he was very intellectual, extremely thoughtful, and really more substantial than most politicians. And he really knew, he had studied all the things that I had also studied writing my book. And so we had a very, what I thought, substantial conversation. But he was not he was sort of shy. He was not. He wanted to talk about intellectual things, but then, as time went on, we got to know each other very well.
Well, almost anyone who knew him, including people who still write about him, describe him as shy, introverted, taciturn. Would you agree with that description?
It's true, but he also conveyed enormous integrity and total reliability and extreme thoughtfulness. He was, at first, when I met him, he was a terrible speaker. We were in Los Angeles once at some fundraiser, and there were a lot of Hollywood people there, and he just didn't feel comfortable. And I thought, this really, there must be better fundraisers around than Yitzhak. But then, which is the astonishing thing, after the peace process started, he gave, I don't know if none of you have read the speeches when he describes what it meant to him to drive on the road to Jerusalem. And they gave a whole series of speeches to the Congress in which the speeches were magnificent and the delivery was liberated. And it was an astonishing transformation. I carried those speeches around with me for many years because, and I still have them. They're really extraordinarily thoughtful and eloquent.
Dr. Kissinger, when you were speaking of his legacy, in my own personal opinion and judgment, that an important part of his legacy is that he ensured Israel's survival, and that he was a reality-based, fact-based, short and medium-term pessimistic about the future, but that he gave hope. I want to take you back to just after the 1967 war. What were the challenges that Israel and Rabin faced after the Six-Day War?
Well, to go to your first point for a second, Dan,
Yeah.
His legacy was really, in a way, at his funeral, the collection of the assemblage of international leaders, including from the Arab world, who came to that funeral, was an absolutely astonishing testimony to the impact of a man who really hadn't ever tried to make that kind of an impact. Now, after '67, Israel was in the position that it had conquered, had defeated all its neighbors. It had its army along the Suez Canal and on the Golan Heights at and it had occupied the Western Bank, and Jerusalem was reunited. But Israel had not decided what attitude it should take in relation to all these conquests. And on the other hand, the Arab states were not prepared to accept any aspect of the existence of Israel. People now talk about the '67 borders, but no Arab country accepted even the '67 borders at that time.